This is probably, I still shake my head at this, this may be the most notorious document in the history of the United States. It's the National Security Study Memorandum 200, Kissinger report, who was the director of the NSC and Secretary of State, submitted this document to Nixon in '74, I think, just a couple years after the Rockefeller Commission report. Now, it's interesting, Kissinger was a protege of Rockefeller. He came up through the ranks and was assisted a great deal, so I'm told. It was declassified in '89, so it was top secret for several years. The focus was, again, population growth, but on the international scene, and you can guess the conclusions. Growth rates are unprecedented. The lesser developed countries are growing much faster than our nations. This will threaten the U.S. imports. It will threaten our national stability, and we have to do something immediately. The tone of the document is 200 pages plus, was urgent. We have to do something now. It's critical. The sky is falling. Their goals were to have a replacement fertility in developing countries in 1985, and replacement fertility in the lesser developed countries by 2000. So they're actually going to take their program to developed countries first, and then export it to the lesser developed countries. It doesn't make sense because they're more concerned, but I think my interpretation now, knowing what I'm going to tell you next, is I think they needed to be a home base, work out this place where they had control, rather than go to a foreign land and try to work out how they're going to instill propaganda to reduce population. Let's work in our home territory. We control the media. We control the healthcare system. That was probably what they were thinking. Recombinant DNA techniques. Targeting vaccinia virus express secretory beta subunit. What they do is they know that if you take naked DNA and inject it into mammalian tissue, you can express. It'll function. DNA is how proteins in your body are created. So you have two options on an anti-fertility front. If you put HCG, the DNA sequence for HCG, into a virus, inject it, what that can do is create an HCG forever. And if it's foreign enough, then you'll get antibodies for it. Now, they've always had trouble getting HCG to be recognized by the body. So the other way they do it is put, instead of the sequence that makes HCG hormone, they make the sequence that makes the HCG antibody. It's passive immunization. So when the body reads the DNA and creates this along with whatever proteins in the cell, it will make the antibodies immediately, indefinitely. So it's basically, through DNA technique, it's a stealth way. I mean, you won't be able to figure this. It would be a sophisticated lab to discover this. And they've done it, for example, in this study, vaccinia, which is the smallpox. So you can put this in a smallpox vaccine. I don't know how you discover it. It's even done in plants. They've done this in tobacco plants. They've put this DNA sequences into plants, and it expresses anti-HCG antibodies. Okay, well, is thimerosal a candidate to be a population control agent? It would have to, in theory, here's what we need. It would have to, we know it reduces the likelihood of consummation. That children are affected, social problems obviously would less likely be married and have children. But does it reduce fertility, or worse, is it an abortifactor? This was a study by Gerhard in 1998. They looked at basically women who couldn't get pregnant, had repeated miscarriages, and they found those that were in the hormonal category had over twice the average amount of mercury in their urine than those in other categories. So there was a suggestion here that higher mercury, the higher rates of miscarriage. It was related to amalgams. The more amalgams they got, the more mercury was showing up in their post-provocative urines when they gave them that chelation challenge. It's the same for males. Hong Kong subfertile males, they found a direct correlation between the number of sperm and the amount of mercury that was measured in seminal vesicle fluid. Not only were the number down, but the activity, the motion was down. They weren't functioning as well, and they had more abnormalities. So it is potential. The best way to answer that question is look at other generations that got exposed to mercury, and this is a good group, and not in that sense, but Pink's disease was mercury poisoning occurred mostly in United Kingdom and Australia and some in Canada from mercury-containing teething powder in the 20s, 30s, 40s. And this was an article I read, and it kind of fell off the floor when I read it. And Daly, Society for Social History of Medicine, an article about Pink's disease victims, saying, meanwhile, the cause having been identified and accepted, Pink's disease disappeared, but its consequences emerged much later in an unexpected quarter as a cause of male infertility. I got a survey from a woman who runs the largest Pink's disease support group in Australia and found that miscarriages, infertility in male and females, and stillbirths were between 1.5 and 3.5 times more likely in people that had mercury poisoning Pink's disease. One disease completely disappeared after the calomel lotion, the teething lotion, was removed, and that's Young's disease. And this was a triad of sinusitis, airway infections, and obstruction of the small tubules in the seminal vesicles in fertile males. That entity, uncommon as it was, just disappeared from the records after they took this out. So scientists and physicians finally had to admit that, yeah, this was due to mercury poisoning. We called this unknown syndrome for years. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? All the regulatory agencies consider mercury a potential genocide agent, population control agent. This is two statements I showed earlier: mental retardation, developmental toxin, intrauterine deaths, perinatal deaths, other congenital malformations. Now this is the level of deception that is just everywhere. This is a list I showed you earlier, these 8 papers that have nothing to do with injecting mercury into kids. I looked at it again, and there were 2 papers that were interesting. And now this is a list of papers that the FDA is saying, here's the proof of safety. That's important. This isn't just a list of floating. This is their evidence that mercury is safe. Let's look at these 2 papers. Journal of Pharmacology, 1990. Scientists put a little thimerosal on the trachea of sheep. And the trachea have these little hairs called cilia. They're very important for reproductive function. After 40 to 100 minutes, the cilia died. Here's one place the cilia are, male sperm. Here's another place, the fallopian tubes in the female reproductive system. So we have a biological mechanism, don't we? The other paper, interesting, this was published in 1975. They looked at the effect of mercury in pregnant animals, which you would think that any regulatory agency should do. And by the way, the flu vaccine, if you pull the manufacturer's sheet, they'll say has not been tested in pregnant animals or humans. We don't know. But we're recommending injecting it into pregnant humans. But that's what the manufacturing sheet says, the inserts. Here's what they found. When they concluded, it's sort of funny, they said there's no birth defects. And if you read just a summary, that's all you would know. It doesn't cause birth defects. But the reason it doesn't, because the animals died. The infants died before they were born. There was a 14 to 36 time higher death rate in rabbits. I guess that's not really what they meant when the rabbit died. I don't think they had that in mind. And 3-fold deaths of rats just dropping it in the peritoneal cavity. This wasn't even injecting it. And I have to tell you that this is thimerosal. Mercury in a vaccine is worse because it contains adjuvants like aluminum. And aluminum makes mercury much more deadly. So most of these clinical studies are just the preservative, and that's an underestimate of the toxicity. Look at the VAERS database, which we've relied on in the past, and abortion. Nobody's published the data on this, and I had to search this myself for my paper I'm writing. Here's a case of the flu shot. It was given to a 19-year-old. She had an abortion in 2 days. After, it could be a coincidence, of course. You don't make much conclusion over one paper. Here's another one. Hepatitis B vaccine given in pregnancy caused an abortion. So what I did find, I didn't put here, what I did find were 11 cases of abortions with the flu vaccine. Now you have to understand this is an underestimation because the coverage rate for pregnant women is less than 1%. I mean, it's way smaller. And the reporting is less than 1%. So the VAERS was set up for complications of childhood vaccine problems when 70, 90% of the kids get the vaccines. So 11 cases in pregnant women who are hardly getting vaccines is an enormous number. If you look at the other vaccines given, I found over 200 cases of abortions given in pregnancy. So it's unthinkable that any obstetrician could give any kind of vaccine to a pregnant woman when it hasn't been tested. And we've got some evidence that it causes abortions. Okay, the next step in this discovery is, I think thimerosal is a candidate, but what's the U.S. policy? Do the U.S. have a policy on population control? This is where our story gets really, really strange. Okay, this is the Rockefeller Commission report. Some of you may know this stuff. Rockefeller, in March of '72, concluded the 2-year study, and he was asked by Nixon. A committee was formed, I think it was called the Population Zero Population Growth Committee. He was president of the Population Council. Nixon appointed him head of this committee, and he said, study the population issues in the U.S. and let us know what our futures are going to be economically with regards to overpopulation or population growth. Here's what Rockefeller said to Nixon. After 2 years of concentrated effort, we have concluded that in the long run, no substantial benefits will result from further growth of the nation's population. Blah, blah, blah. Key statement. By its very nature, population is a continuing concern and should receive continuing attention. Later generations and later commissions will be able to see the right path further into the future. Key phrase. In any case, no generation needs to know the ultimate goal of the final means, only the direction in which they will be found. So we have a pretty high-level document in America saying that, you know what, you got population problems, we need to do something about it, and no, you don't have to tell the American people. Key document number